Number 3, the confidence of my life is doing God's will. Here's the key, verse 15. Instead, you ought to say, if the Lord wills, we will live and do this or that. I don't even know I have tomorrow. In fact, I don't even know I have this afternoon. In fact, you don't even know if you're going to make it through church. Which reminds me of our initial Sunday at Quidnessa Baptist Church when they had this big plaque on the wall that said those that died in the service. And it had Korea, World War II, World War I, Spanish American. My son saw that and he said, did they die in first service or second? Because he knew, how hard it was to go through church. Well, you don't know if you're going to make it through the service in church. But the confidence of our life is that we say, if the Lord wills, we'll live and do this or that. The confidence of my life is doing God's will. Now listen, there's some great people. In the East, I don't know if they have it here, but there's Borden milk and Borden dairy products. Well, that was a wealthy Eastern family. And they had a wealthy son named William. And William Borden came from this wealthy and privileged family. He was a graduate of Yale University. He had the promise of a wonderful and lucrative career running the family business before him. But instead, through his interaction with this book, he felt that life was not to gather money. So he says, if it's not to gather money, I'm not going to stay in the family business because that's all that we're doing. He says, I'm going to do something else. And so he said, God wants me to be a missionary. And so he left to be a missionary in China. He left for the field even though his family and friends thought him a fool for going. I mean, he left behind an oceanfront palace that the Borden family owned, a mountain retreat that he grew up in with stocked hunting grounds. I mean, he had the life that people dream of that work can never get. Before he ever reached China, he was learning, he was going to go to the remote remote Muslim tribes of China that had never been reached. So he wanted to learn about Islam and he wanted to learn the language they spoke, and so he took over a little primer time, a study time in Egypt to learn this before he went on to across Afghanistan and into that part of China. And while he was in Egypt, he contracted a fatal disease and died. And you know what all the people back in Philadelphia said? What a waste. Oh, Willie, he lost all that. He could have been rich. He had given up everything to follow Jesus. He died possessing nothing in this world. But Borden of Yale did not regret it. We know this because he left a note on his nightstand as he lay dying in Egypt of this horrible disease. He wrote 3 things on his note. No reserves. No retreats. No regrets. That's the way to live. He had already given it all to the Lord. No reserves. Even when he contracted this disease, no retreats. And even as he lay dying, no regrets. Do you know what happened? Same thing with Jim Elliot. There was such an overwhelming movement in the United States when young people heard that this wealthy, poloed, part of a socialite, aristocratic family gave it all up and died in a little measly room in a slum in Egypt for Jesus Christ, that hundreds stepped forward and went out for Christ. The confidence of my life is doing God's will. Look back at John chapter 4, the Gospel of John. That's the 4th book of the New Testament. I want to show you that was a confidence of somebody else's life too, not just William Borden of Yale. Jesus had that confidence. Jesus said in John 4 and verse 34, this is great. This is what James is talking about. Maybe even he was thinking of his brother when he wrote these words. But John 4 verse 34, Jesus said this, my food. Now most of us aren't very far from our food. In fact, I have 5 sons. And, it's amazing the size of the bowls they're starting to use. I mean, you wonder how you feed them. The food is important when they're starting to grow. Jesus says, my food, listen, verse 34, is to do the will of him who sent me and to finish his work. Now turn over to chapter 6, verse 38. He talked about this a lot. And he said, the confidence of my life is doing God's will. My food is to do his will. Look at 6:38. He says, I have come down from heaven not to do my own will, not to do my own thing, not to turn my own way. But 38 says, but the will of him who sent me. Now, look at 19, chapter 19. Look at the end of Jesus' life on earth. 19:30. Because he says, my food is to do God's will. I came down from heaven to do his will. And so at the end of his life, look what he says in verse 30 of chapter 19. So when Jesus had received the sour wine, he said, it is finished. To tell us that, it's one word in Greek. You know what he's saying? I did God's will. I did it. No reserves, no retreat, no regrets. I did it. Now that's a great way to die. The Apostle Paul says, I finished my course. I've kept the faith. I'm going to heaven. Now that's the way to die. Not moaning that, I wish I would have done this. Why didn't I do that? I've wasted my life. No. Confidence. How do you get that confidence? Back to James. You've got to keep going back to James. That's our key, okay? I don't want you to get lost, and I have to remind you, because some of you will stay there in John and start reading. I don't want you to miss this ending, because it ends nicely, okay? The purpose of my life, verse 13, isn't to gather money. Verse 14, the brevity of my life is part of God's plan. Verse 15, the confidence of my life is having God's will like my food for every day and the purpose of my life and what I focus on, and I want to die saying, I did your will.